Imagine this. The most powerful office in the world just tried to squeeze Africa dry. 15% tariffs, targeting gold, cocoa, cotton, Africa's lifelines. Washington assumed fear would bend a continent. Billions of dollars dangled like a leash, ready to pull nations to their knees. But then, one voice broke the script. Not timid, not apologetic, defiant. Ibrahim Traore, young, untested by the old guards, stared down the storm and declared, "Africa is done kneeling." It wasn't just a sentence. It was a declaration that shattered centuries of economic chains. Social media erupted. Analysts called it reckless. Citizens called it revolutionary. For decades, Africa had been taught to comply, to calculate, to beg. And now, a single country, a landlocked nation often dismissed as peripheral, had dared to rewrite the rules. What happens when one man turns tariffs into a mirror reflecting arrogance? When fear loses its grip and courage spreads like wildfire? If Burkina Faso can defy the world, what might the rest of the continent do next? The stage is set. The old order trembles, and every eye is on Traore. The streets of Ouagadougou pulsed with a tension that no one could ignore. Markets paused. Radios whispered the news. Shopkeepers, students, and taxi drivers all felt it, the audacity of a nation refusing to bow. Traore's words were not just rhetoric. They were a spark, lighting a fuse that had long been smothered by fear and dependence. Every shipment delayed. Every export threatened. Every calculation Washington had made crumbled against the weight of principle. In the halls of power, diplomats scrambled. Notes were written in haste. Calls made in secrecy. How could a small, landlocked country challenge the United States so openly? They asked each other. Analysts pored over spreadsheets. 15% tariffs. Nearly $2 billion in threatened exports. But it wasn't just numbers, it was pride, sovereignty, and the very idea that Africa might finally control its own destiny. Traore understood this. He had spent years in the Sahel, watching his country survive droughts, terrorist attacks, and decades of neglect. This wasn't a gamble, it was a declaration of survival. Meanwhile, across the continent, whispers became conversations. From Accra to Addis Ababa, citizens discussed, debated, and dreamed aloud. Could one nation's defiance become a blueprint? Could courage ripple beyond borders? Across deserts, rivers, and mountains, reaching governments and people who had long been taught compliance. The question hung in the air, electric and unnerving. Inside Traore's office, maps covered the walls. Routes, ports, trade corridors, alternative buyers all meticulously analyzed. He moved with calm determination. Each decision was precise. No theatrics. No grandstanding. Only strategy. The young leader knew this moment could define a generation. And yet, there was an almost poetic audacity to it. A country often dismissed as peripheral now commanded attention from capitals that had once dictated its every move. Outside, in the city, students painted murals. Africa will not kneel, they wrote, their brushes bold against concrete. Social media accounts exploded with hashtags celebrating defiance, courage, and sovereignty. For the first time in decades, ordinary Africans saw power not as a distant abstraction, but as something achievable, something real. Traore had not merely rejected a tariff, he had rejected a century of imposed inferiority. And the world was watching. Washington expected negotiation, appeasement, perhaps a reluctant concession. Instead, it got clarity. Traore had flipped the narrative. The tariffs, designed to coerce, now reflected the arrogance of an empire that assumed obedience. For Africans and observers alike, it was a revelation. Fear could be broken, leverage could be challenged, and dignity could be defended. But even as optimism surged, the stakes remained terrifying. One misstep could invite retaliation, economic isolation. Or worse, Traore knew that this line in the sand was only the beginning. The first move had been made, the challenge issued. Now, every action, every decision, would be scrutinized. Every observer, from neighboring nations to distant capitals, was waiting for the next signal. Would Africa unite behind this defiance? Or would fear reclaim its throne? The answer was not yet clear, but as the sun set over Ouagadougou, painting the city in gold and shadow, one truth lingered. The old order had been shaken. One young leader, a small nation, a bold refusal, and the world had taken notice. And in that silence before the storm, one question throbbed louder than any market report or headline. If a single officer from a seemingly peripheral country can redraw the rules of global trade, what happens when the entire continent decides it will no longer kneel? The sun had barely risen over the Sahel when Ibrahim Traore first felt the weight of the desert on his shoulders. Dust stung his eyes, wind whipped across the cracked earth, and the air smelled of both smoke and survival. He was 18, newly enlisted, and the world seemed indifferent to the struggles of Burkina Faso's scattered villages. Terrorists, bandits, and corruption were constants. Hunger and fear were relentless teachers. Yet in the midst of chaos, something remarkable emerged, a clarity of purpose, a refusal to be broken. Traore's early days in the army were not glamorous. Drill mornings arrived before dawn. Nights were spent on patrols where every shadow could conceal death. He learned to read the land, the whispers of the wind, the way a path could betray an ambush, the subtle signs of villagers who had long lost faith in authority. His commanders often underestimated him. Too young, too impulsive, they muttered. But Traore's mind was a crucible, burning lessons into instinct. Every decision, every hesitation, carried consequences far beyond himself. In the dry season of 2009, a raid on a bandit encampment became a turning point. Traore, then a junior officer, led a small unit through sand and thorn, guided by intuition, courage, and a relentless sense of duty. The mission succeeded not through superior firepower, but through discipline, foresight, and trust. By the time the sun fell beyond the horizon, he had earned a reputation, calm under pressure, relentless in pursuit of justice, and unwilling to sacrifice principle for convenience. Stories of his bravery traveled through barracks, whispered in villages, and eventually reached the ears of senior leaders. Yet, military prowess alone does not make a statesman. Traore observed more than he acted. He watched international forces, NGOs, and foreign diplomats maneuver across Burkina Faso like players on a chessboard, treating the people as pieces, not partners. He saw promises of aid that never materialized, strategies written in foreign capitals that ignored the realities on the ground. It frustrated him, it enraged him, and it planted a seed that would later define his political ethos. Sovereignty was not optional, it was survival. By 2015, Traore had risen through the ranks, but the country itself teetered. Terrorist attacks left villages empty, roads unsafe, and markets shuttered. In those moments, the young officer would walk among the people, not as a symbol of power, but as a witness to resilience. He spoke with farmers, merchants, teachers listened to their fears, hopes, and frustrations. Each conversation added weight to a vision, a Burkina Faso that could protect itself, feed itself, and stand on its own. This vision burned quietly beneath the uniform, shaping decisions that would later defy the world's most powerful economic players. It was during this period that Traore began forming the alliances that would prove crucial. Fellow officers who shared his principles, civil servants who had grown weary of foreign strings, and even local leaders, skeptical of change, gravitated toward his ideas. Conversations in dimly lit rooms, often interrupted by distant gunfire or the chatter of market life, became strategy sessions for a future that few dared imagine. They spoke of sovereignty, of dignity, of a country no longer waiting for permission. And yet, for all his planning, one lesson remained clear. Courage alone is not enough. Every victory, every strategic decision could provoke backlash. His enemies were not only the extremists in the Sahel, but also the entrenched interests that benefited from Burkina Faso's dependence. Each move had to be precise, each statement deliberate, each alliance fortified. Traore was learning not just how to lead soldiers, but how to navigate power, influence, and the invisible chains of economic and political control. By the time he was 36, Ibrahim Traore was no longer just a soldier. He was a symbol of possibility, a man forged by the desert, by the grind of conflict, and by a vision of an Africa that could dare to stand tall. But even as he prepared to take office, whispers persisted. Could one young officer, untested in the political arena, face the pressure of global powers without bending? Could the world tolerate a Burkina Faso that refused to kneel? The answer, Traore knew, would not be measured in speeches alone. It would be measured in decisions, in defiance, and in the courage to act when fear threatened to paralyze the nation. And then came the moment that would test everything. A tariff ultimatum from the United States, aimed squarely at the backbone of Burkina Faso's economy. A challenge that would define not just one country, but the spirit of an entire continent. The first communiqué arrived in Ouagadougou like a storm warning. 15% tariffs, $2 billion in threatened exports, gold, cotton, cocoa, the backbone of Burkina Faso's fragile economy. In Washington, it was a routine exercise in leverage, apply pressure, intimidate leaders, and bend a nation to compliance. For decades, this strategy had worked across continents. For decades, Africa had bowed quietly, calculating survival over dignity. Traore read the notice carefully, his eyes scanning each line as though it contained both a threat and a challenge. Others would have panicked. Advisors whispered about economic collapse, budget déficit, and foreign debt. But Traore saw through the numbers. He saw the moral calculus behind the percentages, the centuries-old script that assumed obedience. 15%, $2 billion. The analysts said. He saw leverage, he saw chains, and he saw an opportunity to break them. In the grand hall of his office, he gathered his closest advisors. Maps of trade routes, supply chains, and foreign buyers were spread across the table. Each scenario was dissected, each consequence calculated. They spoke in hushed tones, weighing options, debating risks. We could negotiate, one suggested. Another argued for temporary concessions, but Traore's voice cut through the room with quiet authority. Negotiation is a trap. We do not kneel. Outside, the city was alive with unease. Radio stations buzzed with speculation. Markets slowed as merchants absorbed the news. Yet, beneath the uncertainty, a subtle current of anticipation grew. People sensed that something unprecedented was unfolding. A small country, long overlooked, was poised to defy the economic rules written by distant capitals. Analysts in New York and London adjusted their models frantically. Cocoa futures shifted. Cotton indices wavered. Gold contracts trembled as investors realized the risk was no longer hypothetical. This was not mere economics. It was theater, morality, and strategy, all rolled into one act. Traore understood the optics. He understood that defiance, when rooted in principle and backed by strategy, could ripple far beyond the numbers. Meanwhile, the African Union convened emergency sessions. 34 nations watched Burkina Faso closely. Some skeptical, others inspired. Could a landlocked country withstand the might of Washington's economic machinery? Could one leader's refusal ignite a continental awakening? Swap lines, rerouted trade, regional coordination all became part of a plan designed to absorb the shock without bending the nation's will. Inside the West African capitals, whispers turned to open debate. Economists, policymakers, and journalists asked the same question. Was Burkina Faso merely courageous, or was it pioneering a new paradigm? Could tariffs, once the silent whip of empires, now become a mirror, exposing the fragility of power built on fear? Traore's strategy was deliberate. Every decision, every public statement, every silent move projected confidence. He turned vulnerability into leverage, risk into a statement of sovereignty. The global press scrambled to interpret the moment. Headlines splashed across continents. A tiny nation defies Washington. Africa says no. Traore's bold gamble. Social media exploded. Students painted murals. Teachers held impromptu discussions. The idea of standing firm, long relegated to history books, had returned as a living, breathing possibility. And yet, the stakes were real. 15% tariffs threatened livelihoods, budgets, and foreign reserves. The old order expected a bend, a concession, a capitulation. Traore offered none. Each moment of hesitation might have signaled weakness, but he did not falter. Each analysis, each projected loss, became a reason to act decisively. Sovereignty, he knew, could not be bartered away even for billions. By nightfall, Ouagadougou was quiet, but not subdued. The city felt the weight of a decision that extended beyond borders. Traore stood at the balcony, watching lights flicker across the Sahel, thinking not of the $2 billion threatened, but of the centuries of dignity denied. He understood something few outside Africa could grasp. Tariffs were more than percentages. They were a test of courage, a measure of independence, and an opportunity to redefine. When the first shipments of gold and cocoa reached alternative markets, and Washington realized Burkina Faso would not bend, how far would the ripple effect travel? Could one nation's defiance truly awaken an entire continent? The morning after Traore's declaration, the halls of the African Union in Addis Ababa were electric. Diplomats, envoys, and policy advisors convened hurriedly, papers rustling, phones buzzing, eyes darting across screens. Burkina Faso's refusal to bow to Washington's tariffs had shifted more than economics. It had shifted perceptions of power. For decades, the continent had watched quietly as foreign capitals dictated trade, finance, and even security. Now, a small nation had drawn a line, and the question everyone asked was simple. Could unity amplify this defiance? Inside the chamber, debates raged. Some voices were cautious. We cannot openly oppose the United States. One delegate argued. Our budgets depend on foreign aid and trade. Others were emboldened. If Burkina Faso can survive, we can too, countered a representative from Nigeria, eyes fixed on the map of Africa's interconnected markets. Traore's audacity had given birth to a conversation that had been impossible for decades. Fear had long been the continent's quiet governor. Now, courage threatened to replace it. Back in Ouagadougou, Traore worked methodically. Trade corridors, reserve pooling, and alternative buyers were mapped with precision. Grain shipments were redirected to Asia. Gold exports were arranged through Moscow. Cotton and cocoa contracts flowed toward Brazil and Europe. Within 72 hours, the plan was in motion. It was more than a contingency. It was a statement. Africa would no longer be cornered by old powers. Across the continent, the dominoes began to fall. Lagos saw economists and trade officials scrutinize supply chains in a way they hadn't dared before. Johannesburg debated legal frameworks to bypass tariffs. Nairobi studied the speed with which Burkina Faso rerouted exports, calculating that East African tea and horticulture could thrive in Gulf markets without London auctions. Each capital, each city, recognized the power of coordinated defiance. The media amplified the effect. Stories of murals, social media campaigns, and student-led discussions filled news feeds and classrooms alike. Hashtags celebrated sovereignty, courage, and the audacity to challenge entrenched economic hierarchies. Citizens, long accustomed to seeing compliance as survival, began to imagine something new: collective strength. The psychological impact was seismic. A single voice had sparked a chorus of possibilities across 34 nations. Meanwhile, analysts outside Africa struggled to interpret the speed of response. How can a country with a GDP of barely 20 billion withstand $2 billion in threatened tariffs? Asked commentators in New York and London. Wall Street trembled, not because of the sums involved, but because the narrative had shifted. Economic pressure, once the invisible leash, now reflected the fragility of its wielder. Traore had transformed numbers into symbols, turning potential collapse into a testament of agency. Within the African Union, emergency swap lines were activated, reserves were pooled, trade agreements were rewritten overnight. Analysts calculated that nearly 95% of the tariff impact could be absorbed through these coordinated measures. Africa, often portrayed as fragmented, was demonstrating cohesion. The old colonial tactic of divide and rule was meeting its match in strategic unity. Yet, not everyone was convinced. Some leaders fretted about retaliation, market volatility, and diplomatic isolation. They whispered of caution in corridors, worried that one misstep could invite punitive measures. Traore, however, had anticipated these doubts. Each step was calculated, each risk accounted for. The message was clear. Fear would no longer govern decisions. Principle and coordination would. By dusk, Ouagadougou pulsed with cautious celebration. Markets that had feared collapse stabilized. Citizens waved flags, painted murals, and repeated Traore's words. Africa is done, kneeling. Across the continent, a silent question persisted in parliaments, cafes, and classrooms. Could a continent collectively defy economic coercion? Could courage spread faster than fear? The answer remained uncertain, but one fact was undeniable. The landscape of African diplomacy and trade had been irrevocably altered. The ripple effects of a single decision were now testing the assumptions of centuries as Washington re-evaluated its strategy, watching 34 nations coordinate against tariffs. The question loomed. Could this spark a new era where Africa dictates its own economic terms, or would the old powers find a counterstrike to reclaim dominance? News of Burkina Faso's defiance reverberated far beyond the Sahel. In New York, London, and Chicago, trading floors paused mid-sentence, eyes glued to screens, tracking cocoa futures, cotton indices, and gold contracts. Analysts muttered under their breath. This is unprecedented. How can a nation with barely 20 billion in GDP unsettle markets globally? Wall Street, accustomed to predictable patterns, found itself scrambling. The numbers were alarming. Billions in threatened exports, rerouted supply chains, and a continent poised to observe Burkina Faso's lead, yet the tremor was more psychological than financial. Investors realized that the old rules no longer applied. Tariffs, once an invisible whip, had become a mirror reflecting arrogance and miscalculation. Confidence in Western leverage faltered. Cocoa futures surged 5% overnight. Cotton jumped 3%. Gold contracts spiked, as traders understood that Africa's response wasn't panic, it was strategy. A small, landlocked country had rewritten expectations. Across Europe, corporate boards convened emergency calls. Multinational companies that had relied on African exports began reassessing contracts, looking for alternative routes. Brussels officially echoed Washington's calls for restraint, but in secret, European firms quietly absorbed more cocoa, textiles, and crude oil than before. The lesson was clear. Losing Africa meant losing future growth. Tariffs could no longer bend nations, they could only provoke adaptation. In Asia, Beijing moved decisively. Mineral purchase agreements were expanded for cobalt, manganese, and lithium, the lifeblood of the green transition. Currency swap lines allowed African central banks to bypass the US dollar, creating an economic buffer that Washington had not anticipated. Moscow followed, purchasing gold reserves at above-market rates and offering security cooperation packages. New Delhi signed long-term deals for grains, cotton, and cashew nuts, while opening access to pharmaceutical exports. Each move quietly signaled a structural shift in global trade dynamics. Africa was no longer a passive player. Back in Burkina Faso, Traore watched the unfolding domino effect with measured calm. He understood the symbolism. The world's economic centers were reacting not to threats or appeals, but to the clarity of his decision. Tariffs, designed to intimidate, were revealing the vulnerabilities of a system that had long relied on fear. Across the continent, citizens celebrated the visible proof of independence. Murals, hashtags, and viral videos reinforced the narrative that courage could ripple faster than coercion. Nigeria and South Africa, the continent's economic heavyweights, studied the developments closely. Abuja realized that renegotiating oil contracts, long dictated by Western intermediaries, could now be approached with renewed leverage. Pretoria, a BRICS member, saw the potential to strengthen multipolar partnerships. Kenya analyzed how trade hubs could pivot exports away from traditional Western markets. Each nation recognized the power of coordination, inspired by the small but decisive actions of Burkina Faso. Meanwhile, media across the globe framed the event differently depending on perspective. Some painted Traore as reckless, warning of economic instability. Others hailed him as visionary, a symbol of Africa reclaiming agency. Social media amplified the debate. connecting students in Johannesburg to activists in Port-au-Prince, linking small farmers in Bamako to economists in Lagos. Across continents, the narrative was no longer about a tariff dispute. It was about dignity, sovereignty, and the birth of a multipolar economic reality. In trading rooms and parliaments alike, the question arose, could one nation's defiance inspire a continent to act collectively? Could the dominoes set in motion in Ouagadougou topple centuries of economic compliance? Traore leadership, forged on the battlefield, was proving to be equally effective on the global stage. Courage and clarity were outperforming leverage and intimidation. And yet, despite the triumph, unease lingered. Every move carried risk. An overreaction from Washington or miscalculations in regional coordination could provoke a backlash, destabilize markets, or fracture the emerging solidarity. Traore knew that the true test was only beginning Gaia, sustaining unity, reinforcing alternative trade networks, and ensuring that the momentum of defiance would not be squandered by fear or complacency. As markets stabilized and the world began to recalibrate, a deeper question pulsed in every capital, boardroom, and classroom. If Burkina Faso's courage can ripple across continents, could the same spirit ignite a permanent shift in global power? Or would the old empires strike back to reclaim their dominance? The streets of Ouagadougou were alive like never before. The early hum of traffic carried with it conversations that had long been hushed or cautious. News of Traore's defiance spread rapidly, not through official statements alone, but through whispers in markets, university dorms, and coffee shops. People felt the pulse of possibility in their hands, in their feet, in the way they dared to lift their voices without fear. Students painted murals on walls with broad strokes. Africa will not kneel, and sovereignty is our birthright. Their brushes smeared against dusty concrete, leaving symbols of resistance for all to see. Teachers in classrooms paused lectures to discuss what had happened, asking students, could one nation change the rules? Could courage replace fear as the currency of survival? Even street vendors, who had long calculated every day for subsistence, felt a flicker of pride and potential. Social media exploded. Hashtags went viral across the continent, and the diaspora, Africa will not kneel, Traore defiance, sovereignty now. Videos of Traore's speeches were shared millions of times from Lagos to London, from New York to Johannesburg. Ordinary citizens, who had been trained by decades of dependency to measure survival over dignity, began to envision something different. Courage, they realized, could ripple faster than coercion. In Bamako, local community leaders organized forums where they discussed how Burkina Faso's actions could be replicated regionally. Farmers shared strategies for rerouting produce to new markets, bypassing old trade intermediaries. Cooperatives in Côte d'Ivoire debated similar approaches for cocoa and coffee exports. Across West Africa, a quiet revolution of planning, coordination, and solidarity began to take root. It was decentralized, organic, and powerful. Meanwhile, young Africans in Johannesburg and Nairobi debated policy, sovereignty, and economic strategy on university campuses. Student organizations held panels and debates, framing Traore's defiance as both a lesson in courage and a practical guide for reform. Posters appeared overnight. Courage is contagious. Dignity is non-negotiable. For the first time in decades, the youth felt represented not by speeches, but by action, a leader whose choices resonated with their realities and their frustrations. Even diasporas took notice. Communities in Atlanta, London, Paris, and Toronto gathered to discuss Traore's declaration. Social media channels became classrooms, forums, and rallying points. The line "Africa is done kneeling" was repeated in multiple languages, each utterance reinforcing a growing psychological barrier being broken across generations. For many, it was the first time they felt that Africa could act on its own terms, not as a subject to external powers, but as an equal player on the global stage. Yet, beneath the excitement, there was tension. Citizens understood that defiance came with consequences. Economic retaliation, political pushback, or missteps in regional coordination could reverse gains. Families worried about market instability, and food prices. Traders measured risks with the precision of decades of hardship. But in the heart of this unease lay a newfound hope, a collective recognition that standing firm was not just morally right, but achievable. In capitals across Africa, governments quietly monitored citizen reactions. Murals, hashtags, and public forums were more than symbols. They were indicators of momentum. Policymakers realized that if this social awakening was harnessed, it could strengthen continental unity, diversify trade, and empower a generation ready to challenge centuries of dependency. Traore's strategy was proving to be not just about tariffs, but about building a psychological shift across nations and communities. In Ouagadougou, the local press interviewed citizens in the marketplaces. "For the first time, we feel respected," said a cocoa farmer, his hands still dusted with soil. "Not because of aid or promises, but because someone is standing for us." A teacher added, "Our children are learning that independence isn't just history, they can see it today, alive in their streets." These voices, echoing in unison across cities and villages, created a chorus of expectation, pride, and vigilance. By nightfall, Ouagadougou shimmered with a sense of purpose. Lanterns lit alleys where conversations had turned into action plans. Café buzzed with debate about alternative trade routes, collective bargaining, and national sovereignty. Young and old, urban and rural, they realized they were witnessing the birth of a continental mindset. Independence was no longer abstract, it was tangible. Across the continent, similar scenes unfolded. In Lagos, community centers organized workshops on bypassing Western trade dependencies. In Nairobi, economists and agricultural specialists drafted proposals for alternative export hubs. Even in smaller towns in Mali and Senegal, youth groups mobilized discussions about sovereignty, cooperation, and regional resilience. The ripple effect was unstoppable, crossing borders, languages, and generations. As the energy spread from streets to parliaments, one question loomed over every city and village. If citizens and governments alike embraced this awakening, could the defiance of one nation truly ignite a continent-wide movement, or would old powers scramble to reassert control? The shockwaves from Burkina Faso's defiance did not stop at the continent's borders. Across the Atlantic, in Washington, policy advisors scrambled to recalibrate. A small, landlocked nation had not flinched in the face of $2 billion in threatened tariffs. Analysts debated endlessly. How could a country so modest in size unsettle strategies carefully calibrated over decades? Stocks fluctuated, reports were hastily revised, and the narrative of predictable African compliance fractured. In a high-rise office overlooking Pennsylvania Avenue, an aide whispered, "It's not just economics. They're challenging our authority." Meanwhile, Beijing acted quickly, but with precision. Not guns. Mineral purchase agreements were expanded for cobalt, manganese, and lithium, commodities essential for the global green transition. Currency swap lines were opened, allowing African central banks to bypass the US dollar. Africa, long shackled to the swings of the Federal Reserve, suddenly had breathing room. Moscow followed, purchasing gold reserves above market rates, while offering security cooperation packages. New Delhi signed long-term contracts for grains, cotton, and cashew nuts, while extending pharmaceutical exports. Even Europe, though publicly aligned with Washington, discreetly absorbed more African cocoa, textiles, and crude oil than before. The world's economic map was shifting before anyone could fully comprehend it. In Ouagadougou, Traore studied these developments with measured calm. He met with his closest advisors late into the night, pointing at maps and spreadsheets. "Every move we make will be mirrored, analyzed, challenged," he said. "But leverage works both ways. Their overreach is our opportunity." Citizens across Africa watched in amazement. Inspired by the emerging network of alternative partnerships, what had been fear now became opportunity. A tangible demonstration that courage, backed by strategy, could recalibrate the balance of power. Inside capitals across the continent, governments convened emergency meetings. In Lagos, strategists debated renegotiating oil contracts with new confidence. Pretoria, a BRICS member, considered strengthening multipolar partnerships. Nairobi analyzed how tea and horticultural exports could thrive in Gulf markets independently of London auctions. Each capital recognized the power of coordination. Emboldened by Burkina Faso's precedent, the message was unmistakable. Collective defiance could protect sovereignty, stabilize economies, and shift global power balances. Media outlets scrambled to interpret the unfolding scenario. Some condemned Traore as reckless, warning of economic instability and diplomatic backlash. Others hailed him as visionary, a young leader demonstrating that courage could reshape a continent. Across social media, citizens celebrated. Activists organized, and student groups held discussions. Hashtags and murals amplified the narrative that standing firm was not only possible but contagious. Murals appeared in Dakar, Lagos, and Accra, each painted with the same defiant message: Africa does not kneel. Investors and traders felt the tremor acutely. Cocoa contracts in New York climbed 5%. Cotton indices in Chicago surged 3%. Gold contracts spiked as markets understood the symbolic weight. Africa was no longer predictable terrain. Western capitals faced an uncomfortable truth. Economic pressure could no longer dictate compliance. Unchallenged, Traore's strategy had transformed a potential crisis into a demonstration of resilience, proving that principle backed by planning could outmatch leverage. Yet, the situation was delicate. While alternative partnerships were forming, any misstep could provoke retaliation or destabilize markets. Traore balanced daring with prudence, audacity with calculation. Every decision from trade rerouting to diplomatic messaging carried enormous stakes. The world was watching, and the psychological shift was as critical as the material one. In council chambers, advisors debated long into the night, their voices rising over the maps of pipelines, shipping routes, and export hubs. If we falter, they will retaliate. One cautioned. Traore simply nodded it, already seeing 2 moves ahead in his mind's chessboard. In the streets of Ouagadougou, citizens grasped the enormity of what was unfolding. Murals, hashtags, and forums created a tangible energy, a sense that the continent's fate was no longer in distant capitals, but in their own hands. Traders, students, and ordinary families discussed the possibilities aloud. Could this multipolar shield be sustained? Could Africa leverage its natural resources, human capital, and regional cooperation to resist decades of coercion? The answers were forming in real time, in conversations and strategies across the continent. As Burkina Faso and its allies navigated this multipolar web, one question loomed over every city and capital. Could this emerging shield withstand the inevitable pushback from powers unaccustomed to defiance, or would the old order regroup, stronger and more determined, to reclaim control? The morning sun rose over Ouagadougou with a quiet intensity. Streets that had once echoed only the routines of daily survival now carried whispers of strategy and ambition. Traore, aware that defiance alone would not sustain Burkina Faso's independence, turned his attention to building resilience from within. Economic sovereignty, he knew, required more than statements. It demanded action, infrastructure, and careful planning. In a large, sunlit office filled with maps, trade data, and projections, Traore met with his economic council. "We cannot rely on others for our survival," he said, voice calm but resolute. "Every resource, every crop, every shipment must be leveraged for our nation's stability." Advisors nodded, aware that this was not a routine policy meeting. It was the blueprint for a nation's transformation. First came the agricultural reforms. Fields that had long suffered under inconsistent irrigation and limited state support were now prioritized. Government funds were redirected into sustainable irrigation systems, improved seed distribution, and storage facilities designed to reduce post-harvest losses. Local farmers, once at the mercy of fluctuating commodity prices, now found security in state-backed programs. Traore's vision was clear: feed the nation, strengthen trade, and reduce vulnerability to external shocks. Next, the gold and mineral sector was restructured. Mines previously controlled by multinational corporations were placed under national oversight. Profits that had once flowed offshore now reinforced local budgets. Contracts were renegotiated to favor domestic employment, local infrastructure development, and reinvestment into social programs. The message was unequivocal. Burkina Faso would no longer export its wealth while importing inequality. But Traore did not stop there. He understood that resilience required diversification beyond commodities. Small manufacturing hubs were incentivized, textile mills were modernized, and cocoa processing plants were established to add value domestically, rather than exporting raw beans. These efforts created jobs, stabilised urban economies, and cultivated a sense of pride and ownership among citizens. A single nation was learning to convert defiance into practical empowerment. Beyond economics, Traore recognized the importance of strategic alliances. Trade agreements were forged with nations willing to respect Burkina Faso's sovereignty. Gold shipments were redirected to Moscow. Agricultural exports flowed to Asia. Buyers in Brazil and parts of Europe ensured that the nation could withstand tariff pressures without panic. Every contract, every shipment, was a test of independence. The multipolar shield, previously theoretical, was becoming tangible in warehouses, ports, and marketplaces. On the streets, the effects were visible. Markets bustled with renewed activity. Merchants no longer feared sudden losses due to tariffs or foreign manipulation. Farmers spoke openly about their prospects, sharing stories of expanded irrigation and new buyers for their produce. Students observed these changes, realizing that policy and action were inseparable. For the first time, the concept of sovereignty was being taught, not in history books, but in real time, in the lives of ordinary citizens. Meanwhile, Traore monitored the external pressures. He knew that Washington, and others accustomed to unchallenged influence, were watching every step. Decisions had to be deliberate, every announcement strategically timed. He instructed his advisors to track global market reactions, adjust trade routes as needed, and maintain a reserve fund capable of countering unforeseen shocks. Independence, he knew, was fragile without preparation. In meetings that stretched late into the night, planners discussed long-term strategy. Could Burkina Faso transform from a vulnerable, dependent state into a hub of regional resilience? Could the nation inspire neighbors to adopt similar measures, creating a network of economically autonomous countries? Each plan was a step toward a larger vision, a continent capable of standing firmly in a multipolar world. But even as optimism grew, caution remained. Citizens and policymakers alike understood that these initiatives were just the beginning. Global powers accustomed to control could strike back through sanctions, market manipulation, or diplomatic pressure. Every success carried risk. And yet, with each crop harvested, each shipment redirected, and each new contract signed, Burkina Faso demonstrated that strategic planning, courage, and resilience could turn defiance into tangible strength. Cliffhanger. As the nation stabilized internally and forged new alliances, one question pulsed in every capital: market and village. Could Burkina Faso's model of strategic diversification spark a continental wave of resilience? Or would the old powers find ways to reclaim dominance, testing Africa's newfound independence? The momentum from Burkina Faso's domestic reforms rippled across the continent with a velocity few could have predicted. From the Sahel to the Horn of Africa, leaders began to reassess long-held assumptions about trade, sovereignty, and regional cooperation. Nigeria, Africa's largest economy, watched closely. Its officials analyzed oil contracts previously dictated by Western intermediaries, realizing that the precedent set by Ouagadougou offered a blueprint for renegotiation. In Pretoria, South Africa's BRICS-affiliated strategists debated how to leverage multipolar partnerships. Could they protect critical industries while avoiding diplomatic isolation? Johannesburg's chambers were filled with maps of trade corridors, supply chains, and ports, a visualization of a continent slowly learning to act collectively. Every minister, every economic advisor, and every analyst recognized that Burkina Faso's audacity had created not just inspiration but practical opportunity. East Africa responded in kind. Nairobi's ports and agricultural hubs became laboratories for alternative trade. Tea, coffee, and horticultural exports were assessed for new markets in Asia and the Gulf. Economists recalculated projections, assuming reduced dependence on London auctions and European intermediaries. Citizens began to understand that sovereignty was not only political but economic. Control of trade meant control of livelihoods. Meanwhile, the African Union convened an emergency summit in Addis Ababa. Delegates from 34 nations gathered to share data, strategies, and projections. Swap lines were coordinated, reserves pooled, and logistics optimized to mitigate the impact of external tariffs. This was the first time in decades that continental institutions acted with such immediacy and cohesion. The idea that Africa could collectively navigate global pressure was no longer theoretical, it was being implemented in real time. Across West Africa, smaller nations watched Burkina Faso closely. Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, and Senegal saw farmers benefiting from rerouted cocoa and cotton exports. Markets adjusted swiftly, proving that coordinated action could counteract external economic shocks. Community leaders held workshops, teaching local businesses how to diversify their clients and export routes. Murals and slogans adorned walls. Unity protects sovereignty. Collaboration is power. Social media amplified these initiatives, spreading knowledge and motivation across borders. Traore, in Ouagadougou, oversaw these developments. With a calculated focus, he convened daily briefings, assessing progress across trade, agriculture, and finance. Advisors reported on each new partnership, each market adjustment, and each logistical achievement. He understood that the continent's confidence relied not only on symbolism but on tangible results, goods delivered, reserves secured, and livelihoods protected. His leadership had transformed fear into agency. Beyond economics, a political transformation was underway. Governments began coordinating policy positions at summits, aligning stances on tariffs, foreign debt, and regional security. The multipolar shield, previously an abstract idea, was taking shape in institutional agreements, cross-border infrastructure projects, and mutual defense pacts. For the first time, sovereignty was being reinforced by collaboration, rather than isolated heroism. On the streets, ordinary citizens followed the developments with awe and participation. Student groups in Accra, Addis Ababa, and Dakar debated the implications for youth, employment, and entrepreneurship. Trade unions discussed labor protections and cross-border opportunities. In Bamako, a cooperative of farmers celebrated a successful shipment to Asia, a direct result of the coordination inspired by Burkina Faso's defiance. People began to feel that they were active participants in shaping their continent's destiny, not merely spectators. Yet, the challenges were immense. Coordination required trust, and trust had been eroded by decades of foreign interference and internal corruption. Logistics were complex, and some nations struggled to align policies or protect their own markets. Traore understood that sustaining unity would require continuous diplomacy, constant communication, and, above all, tangible success that citizens could see and believe in. By nightfall, the continent was awake to a new possibility. The multipolar shield was no longer a concept, it was operational. Governments, markets, and citizens were all part of a living, breathing network of resilience. The old assumptions of dependence were crumbling, replaced by an emergent narrative of agency, solidarity, and potential. As alternative, trade corridors solidified and regional coordination expanded. One question haunted every capital and village. Could this continental network withstand the inevitable pushback from entrenched global powers, or would Africa's unity be tested in ways that even Traore had yet to anticipate? The tremor from Burkina Faso's defiance spread far beyond Africa's borders, shaking capitals, trading floors, and boardrooms alike. In Washington, advisors huddled in emergency sessions, their faces tense under fluorescent lights. The calculations that had assumed African compliance for decades were collapsing. 15% tariffs on gold, cocoa, and cotton. The levers of economic coercion had failed. They're not just resisting, whispered one analyst. They're rewriting the rules. Stock prices wavered. Cocoa futures surged 5%. Gold contracts spiked. But the more profound shock was psychological. The world had underestimated the courage of a single nation. Beijing moved swiftly. Yet strategically, mineral purchase agreements expanded for cobalt, manganese, and lithium, essential for the global green transition. Currency swap lines were opened, allowing African central banks to bypass the dollar. Moscow purchased gold reserves at above-market rates while offering security cooperation packages. New Delhi secured long-term agricultural imports and extended pharmaceutical exports. Even Europe, officially aligned with Washington, quietly absorbed more African commodities than ever before. The multipolar shield that Traore envisioned was no longer a concept, it was operational. In Ouagadougou, Traore convened his senior advisors in a sunlit war room. The walls lined with maps, spreadsheets, and projections. "Every move we make will be scrutinized," he said. Voice steady. "Each contract, each shipment is a statement of sovereignty. Precision is essential." Advisors debated possible counterstrikes, shifts in credit lines, and the political optics in international capitals. One proposed a temporary concession to avoid escalation. Traore shook his head. "Compliance is weakness. We must remain firm. Strategy is our shield." Across Africa, the ripple effect was immediate. Nigeria recalculated oil contracts previously dictated by Western intermediaries. South Africa analyzed BRICS channels for multipolar alliances. Kenya assessed new export routes for tea and horticultural goods. Inspired by Burkina Faso's quick adaptation, citizens observed these changes in real time. Markets stabilized, contracts were honored, and opportunities for local industries multiplied. Independence, long abstract, became tangible and actionable. Meanwhile, global media struggled to interpret the events. Some condemned Traore as reckless, predicting economic collapse and diplomatic backlash. Others heralded him as visionary, a young leader demonstrating that courage and strategy could recalibrate global power. Across social media, hashtags spread like wildfire. Africa will not kneel. Traore defiance. Multipolar shield. Murals in Dakar, Accra, and Johannesburg celebrated defiance and sovereignty. Student groups debated policy, while entrepreneurs and cooperatives studied alternative trade routes. Ordinary citizens began participating actively in economic decisions. From coordinating shipments to networking with international buyers, financial markets mirrored the psychological shift. Cocoa contracts in New York surged, cotton indices climbed in Chicago, and gold prices fluctuated with renewed volatility. Investors realized that Africa's predictability was gone. A continent could now respond with speed, coordination, and resolve. Western capitals faced a stark reality. Tariffs no longer guaranteed leverage. Traore had transformed a potential crisis into a demonstration of resilience. Yet, the situation was fragile. Coordination was essential, and any misstep could provoke retaliation or market instability. The old powers were watching, poised to exploit divisions. Traore held daily briefings, mapping trade flows, tracking market reactions, and anticipating diplomatic maneuvers. Each decision balanced audacity with calculation, courage with prudence. Across African cities, citizens felt the psychological impact. Farmers, traders, and students observed the multipolar shield taking shape. Murals read, "Unity protects sovereignty and courage is contagious." Social media amplified developments, sharing tangible examples. Gold shipments redirected to Moscow, agricultural exports flowing to Asia, and textile contracts secured in Europe. Confidence spread. The continent's agency was visible and actionable. By nightfall, it was clear. The multipolar shield was operational, spanning finance, trade, and diplomacy. Africa had begun to move not as isolated nations but as a network of coordinated actors. Markets stabilized, citizens engaged, and governments began thinking in terms of long-term sovereignty rather than short-term compliance. Fear, once the continent's invisible governor, was being replaced by strategy, coordination, and resolve. As the multipolar shield strengthened and foreign powers recalibrated their approaches, one question echoed across every capital, boardroom, and marketplace. Could Africa maintain this unprecedented unity under inevitable pressure, Or would entrenched global powers find ways to fracture the continent before its newfound independence could fully take root? The defiance of Burkina Faso was no longer confined to capitals or trading floors. It had ignited a continent-wide awakening among ordinary citizens and praesets, most profoundly the youth. From Lagos to Nairobi, from Accra to Addis Ababa, students, young professionals, and local activists debated, organized, and planned with unprecedented energy. The phrase "Africa is done kneeling" had evolved from a slogan into a rallying cry, uniting people across borders, languages, and cultures in a shared vision of agency and sovereignty. On university campuses in Johannesburg, lecture halls were alive with debates. Economics students examined the implications of multipolar trade partnerships, while political science classes dissected the strategic brilliance behind Traore's decisions. Student unions hosted forums to educate peers on alternative trade routes, regional alliances, and the power of coordinated continental action. Posters and murals appeared overnight. Courage is contagious. Unity protects sovereignty. Sovereignty is our currency. Ahmural. Each hashtag became a visible act of engagement, signaling that Africa's future would no longer be dictated by distant capitals. In Accra, youth organizations, coordinated community workshops, farmers, traders, and local business owners learned how to access new markets, reroute export, and negotiate fairer deals. Cocoa cooperatives celebrated their first shipments to Asia without intermediaries, proving that independence could be both practical and profitable. Social media amplified these victories, connecting cities and countries in a virtual network of knowledge, strategy, and solidarity. The energy was infectious, spreading across both urban and rural areas. Even smaller towns felt the ripple. In Bamako, students organized public debates, workshops, and cultural events focused on sovereignty, economic resilience, and civic responsibility. Local radio stations broadcast discussions on multipolar alliances, trade diversification, and lessons learned from Burkina Faso's defiance. Ordinary citizens, once passive spectators of global policy, now became active participants in shaping their own futures. Market behaviors shifted as merchants adjusted pricing and shipment routes. Reflecting growing confidence in local agency, diaspora communities played a vital role as well. From Paris to London, New York to Toronto, African expatriates shared updates, resources, and strategies. Webinars, panels, and discussion groups connected young Africans across continents. If Burkina Faso can defy the world, so can we, in our own ways, became a common refrain. Across continents, a psychological barrier was breaking. The narrative that Africa must comply with external pressure was no longer accepted as truth. The influence on governments and institutions was significant. Policymakers began taking youth-led initiatives seriously, recognizing that citizen engagement could influence regional strategies. Ministries of Trade and Finance adjusted policies in response to grassroots movements. The African Union monitored the developments closely, understanding that coordinated citizen action reinforced national and continental resilience. Markets reflected these changes. Merchants collaborated to maintain smooth trade. Farmers diversified production to meet new international demands. And cross-border cooperatives shared logistics and knowledge. Youth-led innovation hubs emerged in Lagos, Nairobi, and Dakar, connecting small businesses with foreign buyers and reinforcing the multipolar shield. Traore himself emphasized to his advisors, policy alone is not enough. The people must see, understand, and participate. Independence must be lived, not declared. In Ouagadougou, citizens reported a sense of empowerment. Unlike anything in recent memory, farmers shared success stories of direct exports. Students debated strategy in open forums, and local leaders organized workshops on financial literacy and cooperative development. Murals and social media campaigns chronicled these changes, spreading awareness and building a culture of civic responsibility across Africa. Courage and civic engagement intertwined, creating a multiplier effect that strengthened the continent's collective agency. By nightfall, cities from Dakar to Addis Ababa were buzzing with life and purpose. Public forums, murals, and online debates demonstrated a continent awakening to its own potential. Ordinary citizens were no longer passive bystanders. They were part of the strategy, part of the narrative, and part of the solution. For the first time in decades, the multipolar shield was not merely a policy or trade construct. It was a living social movement, powered by the youth and communities that understood the stakes of sovereignty. As the youth movements and citizen engagement spread across Africa, one question pulsed in every city: village and capital. Could this awakening sustain the momentum necessary to challenge entrenched global powers? Or would the pressures of politics, economy, and old hierarchies eventually test the resolve of a newly awakened continent? By the time the sun rose over Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's defiance had begun to crystallize into something far larger than a single nation's act of courage. Traore understood that policy alone would not guarantee sovereignty. It needed to merge with citizen engagement, youth movements, and coordinated continental action to create an unbreakable framework. The multipolar shield, once theoretical, was being forged in real time through strategy, solidarity, and social energy. Inside the Presidential Council, Traore convened his closest advisors. Maps lined the walls, showing trade routes, export hubs, and alternative markets across the continent and beyond. Charts detailed agricultural output, mineral reserves, and financial reserves. Policy is only as strong as the people who understand and act upon it. He reminded them, "We have created momentum. Now we must ensure it translates into sustainable change." Advisors nodded, recognizing the weight of responsibility. The stakes were no longer limited to Burkina Faso. They encompassed the continent's collective agency. The first step was integration. Policies aimed at economic resilience were aligned with citizen initiatives and youth movements. Agricultural reforms, irrigation projects, and crop diversification were coordinated with cooperative networks across borders. Student-led forums and workshops provided education on trade, finance, and civic responsibility. Young entrepreneurs in Lagos, Nairobi, and Accra were connected to markets previously dominated by Western intermediaries. By synchronizing policy with social engagement, Burkina Faso had created a template that other nations could emulate. Trade strategy was recalibrated. Gold shipments to Moscow, cocoa exports to Asia, and cotton deliveries to Europe formed the backbone of a resilient economy. Governments coordinated logistics and reserve pooling to withstand potential external pressure. Every shipment, every trade agreement, became both a practical and symbolic act, a demonstration that African nations could safeguard sovereignty while thriving economically. The African Union played a critical role in consolidating these efforts. Emergency sessions and regional summits facilitated cross-border cooperation, aligned fiscal policies, and implemented contingency plans. 34 nations participated in initiatives to diversify supply chains, reroute export, and coordinate financial reserves. Citizens, youth groups, and local communities were actively involved, providing feedback, monitoring implementation, and sharing knowledge. The synergy between governance and civil engagement was unprecedented. Social movements reinforced the impact of policy. Murals, hashtags, and public forums amplified the narrative of sovereignty and courage. Ordinary citizens were no longer passive observers. They were active participants in shaping policy outcomes. Markets adapted accordingly, with traders and cooperatives collaborating across borders to secure goods and stabilize prices. Student groups connected with government offices, proposing solutions and assisting with logistics. The multipolar shield became a lived experience, tangible in every shipment, contract, and community project. Meanwhile, the world watched closely. Western powers recalibrated, realizing that conventional economic pressure had limited effectiveness. Alternative partnerships through China, Russia, India, and Latin America offered African nations leverage and stability. Market analysts recognized the structural shift. A continent once perceived as passive was demonstrating the ability to coordinate economically, politically, and socially. Burkina Faso's blueprint provided a model, illustrating that sovereignty could be protected not just by government decree, but by integrated, participatory action. Traore's leadership had transformed the equation. His military precision, strategic foresight, and insistence on principle had inspired not only policy change, but a cultural awakening. Citizens understood that sovereignty required active participation, and governments realized that enduring change relied on empowering communities. The synthesis of policy, citizen engagement, and continental coordination had created a resilience that was difficult to undermine. Yet, challenges remained. Global powers could still attempt subtle forms of influence, market manipulation, sanctions, or political pressure, maintaining alignment among nations, balancing national interests with collective goals, and sustaining civic participation would be critical. But the framework established by Burkina Faso's Defiance offered a robust foundation for navigating these uncertainties. By nightfall, Ouagadougou reflected the new reality. Citizens felt the weight of their agency. Governments coordinated strategically, and young Africans understood that courage combined with informed action could redefine the continent's destiny. The multipolar shield was no longer an abstract concept. It was visible in markets, classrooms, governments, and communities. It was a living system of resilience, forged by strategy, courage, and collaboration. As the synthesis of policy, citizen action, and continental strategy took hold, one question echoed across Africa and the world. Could this integrated model withstand future crises? Or would entrenched global powers test its limits in ways that would challenge the very foundations of the continent's newfound independence? The momentum that began in Ouagadougou had transformed into a continent-wide influence that no one could ignore. Burkina Faso's Defiance, once a single act, now catalyzed a broader awakening. African nations, inspired by Traore's blueprint of sovereignty and resilience, began asserting their power collectively. This was no longer about survival. It was a turning point, a moment where the continent tested its ability to shape global outcomes on its own terms. In Lagos, policymakers convened an unprecedented summit. Oil contracts, previously dictated by Western intermediaries, were renegotiated with newfound leverage. Economists calculated that aligning strategies with Burkina Faso could secure billions in more favorable terms without risking foreign backlash. One senior advisor remarked, "For the first time, size does not dictate influence. Courage and strategy do." The symbolism resonated across the continent. A giant like Nigeria, taking cues from a smaller, bold neighbor, demonstrated that power was not proportional to GDP alone. Johannesburg mirrored this energy. South Africa explored multipolar alliances through BRICS channels, coordinating trade, security, and investment. Pretoria's strategy signaled that Africa could no longer be treated as a passive actor. Nairobi's ports and agricultural hubs thrived under alternative trade arrangements. Tea, coffee, and horticultural exports reached Asia and the Gulf without Western intermediaries. Across Africa, citizen engagement amplified these shifts. Farmers, merchants, and small business owners adjusted logistics, pricing, and production to match the new flow of trade. In Ouagadougou, Traore's office became the nerve center for coordination. Maps, charts, and trade flow projections covered every wall. Meetings ran late into the night, as advisors and regional representatives discussed market adjustments, logistical challenges, and the reinforcement of the multipolar shield. Every shipment, every contract is a statement. Traore reminded them, "This is more than economics. It is a message to the world. Africa will not be coerced." Advisors debated potential risks, currency fluctuations, political backlash, and global economic pressure. Each choice carried stakes for the continent, not just a single nation. Across West Africa, smaller nations observed closely. Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, and Senegal saw farmers benefiting from rerouted cocoa and cotton exports. Cooperative networks shared knowledge, logistics, and strategies to access new markets. In Bamako, students organized debates and forums, analyzing policy implications and educating peers on trade diversification. Murals reading "Unity protects sovereignty and courage is contagious" appeared across cities, symbolizing both civic pride and economic agency. Diaspora communities contributed actively, from Paris to London, New York to Toronto. African expatriates disseminated updates, hosted panels, and coordinated support for local initiatives. If Burkina Faso can defy the world, so can we, in our own way, became a rallying cry. The psychological barrier of dependence was fracturing, replaced by optimism rooted in tangible evidence, shipments delivered, contracts secured, and markets stabilized. Global powers watched nervously. Washington analyzed shifts in trade and financial flows, considering strategies to regain leverage. Europe quietly adjusted commodity purchases to maintain influence. China expanded its partnerships for minerals critical to the green transition. Russia purchased gold reserves at premium rates, while offering military cooperation packages. India secured agricultural imports and extended pharmaceutical exports. Analysts noted that African exports had shifted by nearly $12 billion in 6 months, illustrating the effectiveness of collective strategy. The citizen response reinforced the impact. Markets reflected coordinated actions, while young Africans engaged in forums, entrepreneurial venture, and civic education. Murals, hashtags, and social media campaigns chronicled victories and reinforced solidarity. Ordinary citizens were no longer spectators. They were part of the mechanism that sustained the multipolar shield. Despite these successes, risk remained. Coordination required trust across diverse nations, and market volatility posed constant threats. Political pressures from entrenched powers loomed. Traore understood that sustaining momentum demanded vigilance, infrastructure, and continued engagement of both citizens and governments. Independence was not a single act, it was an ongoing process. By nightfall, the continent had reached a remarkable peak. The multipolar shield was operational and expanding. Governments coordinated trade. Citizens engaged actively, and young Africans saw tangible evidence that strategy and courage could reshape their futures. Burkina Faso had sparked a movement demonstrating the power of unity, foresight, and decisive action. As African nations reached this peak of continental influence, one question loomed larger than any trade statistic or headline. Would entrenched global powers attempt to dismantle this network of autonomy, or could Africa sustain its newfound agency and continue to redefine the rules of international engagement? By the early hours of the morning in Washington, the mood was tense. Economic analysts, diplomats, and advisors convened in emergency sessions, scrolling through data, recalculating risk, and projecting scenarios. Burkina Faso's defiance and the continent-wide ripple it had triggered was far beyond anything anticipated. 15% tariffs on gold, cocoa, and cotton. The levers of economic coercion had failed. One senior advisor muttered, "They're not just resisting, they're rewriting the rules." Wall Street trembled as cocoa futures surged 5%, cotton indices jumped 3%, and gold contracts fluctuated sharply. The psychological impact was as profound as the financial one. The old playbook no longer applied. Europe responded cautiously. Brussels issued statements reinforcing Washington's stance, emphasizing diplomatic restraint. Yet behind closed doors, European companies quietly increased purchases of African commodities. Cocoa, textiles, and crude oil continued to flow unimpeded, as corporate leaders recognized that losing access to African markets could be more damaging than opposing the continent's rising multipolar shield. Ministers debated how to maintain influence without provoking a continental backlash. To aware that public gestures could ignite further unity, Beijing acted decisively. Mineral purchase agreements expanded, particularly for cobalt, manganese, and lithium, essential for the green energy transition. Currency swap lines allowed African central banks to operate independently of the dollar, insulating economies from Federal Reserve fluctuations. Moscow purchased gold reserves at premium rates while offering security cooperation packages. New Delhi negotiated long-term agricultural imports and provided affordable pharmaceuticals, strengthening African nations' autonomy. Each move reinforced the multipolar shield, translating diplomatic strategy into tangible economic and security support. In Ouagadougou, Traore convened his senior advisors in a Sunli strategy room, maps of trade routes, export hubs, and financial projections covered every wall. They will test us, he said, voice steady, eyes scanning the charts. Not only with tariffs, but with pressure we cannot yet see. Every shipment, every contract is a statement of sovereignty. Advisors debated potential counter-strikes, currency manipulation, and diplomatic measures. One suggested a temporary concession to avoid escalation. Traore shook his head. Compliance is weakness. Strategy and courage are our shield. Across Africa, governments adjusted. Nigeria recalculated oil contracts, using multipolar partnerships for leverage. South Africa strengthened BRICS alliances for trade and security coordination. Kenya optimized export routes for tea, coffee, and horticultural goods, reaching Asian and Gulf markets directly. Smaller nations, inspired by Burkina Faso, coordinated logistics, pooled reserves, and diversified supply chains. Markets responded, prices stabilized, trade volumes increased, and citizens saw tangible results of continental coordination. Youth movements and civil society reinforced these outcomes. In Accra, Dakar, and Addis Ababa, students organized forums on trade strategy and civic engagement. Murals and social media campaigns amplified messages of sovereignty and resilience. Farmers, traders, and entrepreneurs actively participated, ensuring shipments reached new markets efficiently. Ordinary citizens, once spectators, had become integral to Africa's multipolar shield. Despite these successes, the situation remained precarious. Western powers debated sanctions, covert, financial maneuver, and diplomatic pressure to regain influence. Analysts warned that credit restrictions, market manipulation, or targeted sanctions could challenge African unity. Traore anticipated these moves, deploying contingency plans, coordinating with regional governments, and maintaining transparency to sustain confidence domestically and continent-wide. In trading hubs, the impact was tangible. Cocoa contracts in New York surged, cotton indices in Chicago adjusted sharply, and gold prices reacted to the multipolar maneuvers. Financial institutions recalibrated risk assessments for African markets, realizing that the continent's predictability had shifted. Investors understood that African nations now had agency, networks, and strategies to counter traditional coercion. By nightfall, the global stage reflected a delicate balance. African nations had consolidated unprecedented coordination, and alternative partnerships offered a buffer against traditional pressures. Citizens, governments, and entrepreneurs had adapted, creating a living network of resilience. Yet the old powers were watching, poised to exploit divisions. The multipolar shield was operational, but sustaining it would require continuous vigilance, strategic foresight, and active engagement from both leaders and populations. As African nations navigated these countermeasures, one question loomed across capitals, trading floors, and communities. Could the continent maintain its multipolar shield under calculated pressure from entrenched global powers, or would attempts to fracture Africa expose vulnerabilities in its newfound autonomy? The victory of Burkina Faso on the global stage had been inspiring, but domestically, the weight of defiance began to show its cracks. Citizens cheered in the streets, murals celebrated sovereignty, and young people debated the future in universities. But behind the scenes, the pressures of rapid change tested every institution. Markets shifted, government agencies scrambled to keep pace with new trade routes, and political factions began to voice concerns. The unity that had carried the continent through its initial successes was fragile, and the cracks were beginning to appear. In Ouagadougou, Traore convened a cabinet meeting early one morning. Advisors spoke urgently about logistics, social unrest, and growing tensions within the military. We have expanded too fast without consolidating internal structures, warned the finance minister. Traore's expression remained calm, but his eyes betrayed concern. Courage on the international stage is nothing if we cannot maintain stability at home, he replied. He emphasized the need to balance audacious policy with the realities of domestic governance. Ensuring that the multipolar shield would not crumble under internal pressures, tensions emerged quickly. Trade hubs experienced bottlenecks as new routes were implemented without sufficient coordination. Farmers in remote areas complained of delays in seed distribution, while urban markets struggled with fluctuating prices. Opposition parties began framing these challenges as failures of governance, calling into question the administration's ability to manage both internal and external pressures. In small towns and villages, citizens debated openly. Had the country prioritized global image over local stability? The military, once united behind Traore's leadership, faced growing dissent. Officers worried about rapid policy changes that affected security allocations, border, monitoring, and resource distribution. Some expressed concern about the speed of reforms and their potential to provoke retaliation from global powers. Traore convened senior military officials, emphasizing coordination and discipline. Our strategy succeeds only if our institutions remain strong, he told them, yet murmurs persisted. A reminder that internal cohesion was never guaranteed. Across Africa, the ripple effect created similar domestic tensions. In Nigeria, rapid shifts in oil contracts triggered regional protests as workers demanded guarantees on jobs and revenue distribution. South Africa faced debates over BRICS alignment versus domestic needs, while Kenya's agricultural sector experienced pushback from communities adjusting to new trade flows. Each nation realized that continental unity and global influence required careful attention to domestic realities. Civil society became a key player in managing these tensions. Student movements, cooperatives, and local NGOs organized forums to educate citizens about the long-term strategy, emphasizing the importance of patience, coordination, and resilience. Workshops on trade, finance, and civic participation helped citizens understand the rationale behind rapid reforms. Murals, campaigns, and local media highlighted both achievements and the challenges ahead, reinforcing the narrative that sovereignty required both courage and collective effort. Even as internal tensions grew, external powers watched carefully. Washington, Brussels, Beijing, Moscow, and New Delhi analyzed every disruption, waiting to see if domestic instability could weaken African unity. Analysts debated whether internal unrest might provide leverage to influence policy decisions. For the first time, the multipolar shield faced not just external pressure but internal testing, a convergence of political pressure, economic, and social stresses that could define the continent's ability to sustain its autonomy. Traore understood the stakes. He addressed his cabinet with clarity. Every challenge we face internally is a test of our resilience. If we falter, external forces will exploit it. But if we endure, the continent will see that sovereignty is achievable not only through defiance, but through careful management of our own affairs. His words resonated across the capital, reinforcing discipline and a sense of purpose. By nightfall, the streets of Ouagadougou were filled with a mixture of celebration and cautious anticipation. Citizens recognized progress, but they also sensed the weight of change. Across Africa, nations were experiencing the same duality: momentum on the global stage, paired with domestic pressures. The continent was learning a difficult lesson. Influence abroad was inseparable from cohesion at home. As Burkina Faso and other African nations navigated these internal crises, one question loomed over every capital: market and village. Could the continent maintain unity and momentum in the face of both domestic unrest and global countermeasures, or would internal fractures threaten to undo the gains of its newfound sovereignty? By the second week of the continental realignment, internal pressures began manifesting in stark and undeniable ways. Protests erupted in major cities, fueled by economic disparities and frustrations over rapid reforms. Streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Accra filled with voices chanting slogans of both support and dissent. "We demand stability," some cried. "Our sovereignty cannot cost our livelihood," shouted others. The excitement that had surged across the continent in the wake of Traore's defiance now collided with the reality of governance. Courage on the global stage did not erase domestic challenges. In Ouagadougou, Traore met with his cabinet and senior military officials in a tense, late-night briefing. Reports streamed in. Supply chain disrupted. Urban markets strained. And protests spreading to smaller towns. Our achievements abroad are inspiring, the finance minister warned. But our citizens fear instability at home. If we do not respond decisively, both could collapse. Traore nodded solemnly. Action must be swift, targeted, and precise. We cannot allow our enemies, foreign or domestic, to exploit chaos. Even within the military, fissures appeared. Some officers questioned whether rapid reforms and international positioning were overstretching resources. In private quarters, a colonel confided to a peer, "Traore's vision is bold, but what if the people cannot follow us?" Such murmurs were a reminder that internal cohesion, like external defiance, required careful cultivation. Meanwhile, in Lagos, Johannesburg, and Nairobi, leaders watched anxiously. Nigeria's oil sector faced worker strikes, while South African unions debated government alignment with BRICS versus domestic priorities. Kenyan agricultural hubs struggled with supply chain bottlenecks, as rural communities voiced concerns over new export arrangements. Each nation realized that continental unity and external influence hinged not only on bold international strategy, but on maintaining domestic legitimacy. Civilians became both participants and arbiters of stability. Youth movements, NGOs, and cooperative associations mobilized to educate and mediate. Public forums addressed concerns about pricing, distribution, and social welfare. Murals and social media campaigns reinforced the message that sovereignty and civic responsibility were intertwined. Citizens had to understand and support the policies that allowed Africa to navigate global pressures successfully. Yet, the unrest escalated beyond peaceful protest. In Ouagadougou, factions within the military staged a brief probing on the uncoordinated coup attempt. Tanks rolled through the streets. Checkpoints were established, and emergency communications scrambled to maintain order. Traore, anticipating such threats, had already deployed loyal units and contingency plans. Within hours, the attempted coup was contained, with leaders detained and loyal forces restoring stability. The event shocked the nation but also demonstrated the importance of preparation, foresight, and trust in capable institutions. Across the continent, news of the attempted coup reverberated. Capitals watched closely, debating lessons learned and precautions needed to prevent similar upheavals. In Bamako, protests turned tense as citizens demanded clarity on government action, while Accra saw peaceful assemblies shift to vocal demonstrations demanding transparency and support for vulnerable communities. Young leaders stepped forward, coordinating dialogues, mediating conflicts, and reinforcing a narrative that sovereignty was inseparable from domestic accountability. Globally, entrenched powers monitored these developments intently. Analysts in Washington, Brussels, Beijing, Moscow, and New Delhi assessed the resilience of the African multipolar shield. Could the continent withstand internal unrest while continuing to project influence abroad? The attempted coup underscored that external pressure and domestic instability could intersect dangerously, potentially testing the limits of the hard-won autonomy. By nightfall, Ouagadougou and other major cities reflected a cautious equilibrium. Citizens resumed their routines with wary optimism. Markets stabilized, and political leaders communicated directly with communities to restore trust. The lesson was clear: courage on the international stage must be matched by vigilance, preparedness, and engagement at home. Africa's path to sovereignty demanded both external defiance and internal resilience. As the continent absorbed the shocks of coups, protests, and political upheaval, one question loomed larger than ever. Could Africa maintain its unity and continue reshaping global power dynamics, or would internal fractures, combined with persistent external pressures, threaten to unravel the gains of its newfound sovereignty? The dust settled slowly over Ouagadougou, leaving a city both scarred and enlightened. The attempted coup, protests, and political upheaval had tested Burkina Faso in ways that few had anticipated. Streets bore the marks of unrest, murals defaced, barricades hastily removed, and marketplaces reopening under cautious vigilance. Yet, amid the visible scars, there was a deeper, more resilient energy, a society that had faced internal and external pressures and emerged with lessons etched into its collective consciousness. Traore convened his cabinet the morning after the unrest. The room was silent, tense, but determined. Reports of disruptions, economic losses, and social unrest were laid out in meticulous detail. "We have paid a price," Traore began, "but understanding that price is how we ensure it does not happen again." Advisors nodded. The message was clear. Sovereignty and defiance were not cost-free. Courage on the international stage had cascading effects that required careful management at home. Economic costs were immediate. Supply chain disruptions, temporary market closures, and delays in agricultural distribution affected thousands. Estimates suggested that combined losses from halted trade, disrupted exports, and recovery costs totaled nearly $500 million. Farmers in remote regions faced delayed seed distribution, while urban merchants grappled with fluctuating prices. Yet these losses were tempered by long-term gains, alternative trade routes, diversified markets, and strengthened regional coordination provided resilience against future shocks. Socially, the cost was measured in trust and cohesion. Citizens who had celebrated sovereignty now questioned governance when daily life faltered. Young leaders and activists played a pivotal role in bridging these gaps. Public forums, town hall meetings, and media campaigns communicated lessons learned, emphasizing that independence required both defiance and responsibility. Murals were repainted, hashtags circulated on social media, and community leaders organized workshops to ensure citizens remained engaged and informed. Politically, the aftermath revealed vulnerabilities. Internal factions, unche hesitant, had tested the boundaries of loyalty and discipline. The military and government agencies conducted reviews to strengthen internal cohesion, leadership training, communication protocols, and crisis management strategies were institutionalized to prevent future fractures. Traore stressed that sovereignty demanded not only external defiance but also robust internal governance. A nation cannot project power abroad if it cannot maintain trust and stability at home, he told his advisors. Across Africa, other nations watched closely. Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, and smaller states absorbed the lessons. Coordinated continental action proved effective in mitigating the coup's impact. Governments invested in emergency response plans, public communication strategies, and citizen engagement initiatives. The continent collectively learned that the multipolar shield was not only about resisting external pressures, but also about anticipating and managing internal risks globally. Analysts recognized the durability of the African strategy. Washington recalculated risk exposure. Brussels assessed supply chain reliability. Beijing and Moscow noted Africa's growing leverage, and New Delhi explored opportunities for mutually beneficial trade without imposing coercion. The attempted coup and subsequent protests had tested the shield, and while costs were real, the structure remained intact. Africa's defiance was resilient, precisely because it had internalized lessons from adversity. For the citizens of Ouagadougou, the experience was transformative. Markets reopened, schools resumed, and community initiatives gained momentum. Farmers, merchants, and students understood that sovereignty was an ongoing process. They had seen the consequences of rapid change, the fragility of institutions, and the importance of civic participation. This dual awareness, pride in international defiance and recognition of domestic responsibility, created a mature understanding of what true independence entailed. By nightfall, the city reflected both the scars of conflict and the promise of resilience. Citizens walked streets that had borne protest and barricades with a newfound awareness. Courage was necessary, but vigilance, coordination, and collective responsibility were equally crucial. Traore's administration began implementing reforms to institutionalize crisis management, strengthen supply chains, and reinforce civic education, ensuring that lessons from the unrest would guide future decisions. As Burkina Faso and the continent assessed the costs and consolidated their gains, one question emerged with gravity. Could Africa sustain its newfound sovereignty? Balancing the courage to defy external powers with the discipline to manage internal pressures, or would future crises test the very foundations of the continent's independence? The first light of dawn fell over Ouagadougou, illuminating streets that had endured turmoil, protest, and uncertainty. Barricades were removed, murals repainted, and marketplaces slowly reopened. But beneath the surface, the city pulsed with renewed energy. Citizens walked with a sense of cautious optimism. The trials of coups, protests, and rapid reforms had left their mark, yet they also carried lessons in resilience and unity. The defiance against external pressures had transformed into a domestic resolve to protect and sustain sovereignty. Traore walked through the central market, observing the rhythm of daily life. Merchants adjusted to new supply chains. Farmers discussed the benefits of alternative export routes, and students held public forums in the squares, debating trade strategy, civic responsibility, and the lessons of recent upheaval. Courage without follow-through is hollow, he told a young entrepreneur, but action that empowers citizens transforms courage into legacy. His words embodied the leadership philosophy that had guided Burkina Faso through both international defiance and internal crises. Across the continent, similar scenes unfolded. In Lagos, Nigeria's oil sector adapted to multipolar trade strategies, while community workshops helped citizens understand complex policy shifts. South Africa's BRICS-aligned initiatives continued to thrive, balancing external partnerships with domestic stability. Kenya's agricultural exports flourished along new routes to Asia and the Gulf, bypassing intermediaries that had historically imposed limitations. Smaller nations, working through the African Union, pooled reserves, shared logistical expertise, and reinforced regional security, creating a network that connected governance, civil society, and economic resilience. Youth movements were central to this renewal. In Accra, Dakar, and Addis Ababa, students and young entrepreneurs facilitated knowledge transfer, organized workshops, and coordinated local initiatives. Murals and digital campaigns spread slogans like "Unity protects sovereignty and courage is contagious," reinforcing the idea that independence was a participatory process. Citizens became active agents, not passive observers, contributing to trade, logistics, and policy awareness. Civic engagement had evolved into a tangible pillar of Africa's multipolar shield. Economically, progress was measurable. Gold, cocoa, cotton, and staple crops reached diversified markets with greater reliability. Investments in irrigation, storage, and processing facilities stabilized supply chains and improved food security. Urban markets reflected the success of coordinated policy. Prices steadied. Traders regained confidence, and local communities benefited from improved access to resources. The reforms that had sparked initial domestic unrest now demonstrated long-term utility, reinforcing trust in governance and strategic planning. Politically, lessons were consolidated. Governments institutionalized emergency protocols, crisis management systems, and citizen engagement frameworks. Coordination through the African Union demonstrated that unity could coexist with national autonomy, providing a resilient structure to navigate both internal and external challenges. Civil society's participation reinforced legitimacy, ensuring that future crises would be met with coordinated response and informed citizens. International observers noted the transformation with equal parts admiration and caution. Washington, Brussels, Beijing, Moscow, and New Delhi recalculated their strategies. Alternative partnerships, diversified trade networks, and strengthened domestic institutions had reduced African vulnerability to conventional economic and diplomatic pressures. Analysts recognized that Africa's defiance, previously symbolic, had evolved into systemic resilience, a continent capable of shaping outcomes while maintaining internal stability. For citizens of Ouagadougou, the dawn symbolized more than a new day. It represented the synthesis of courage, strategy, and shared responsibility. Market activity reflected stability. Educational forums fostered civic understanding, and community initiatives addressed vulnerabilities identified during the recent unrest. Independence was operational, lived daily through both governance and civic participation. Traore reflected on the journey from defiance to continental renewal, from confronting tariffs to managing internal crises. Every step had reinforced a simple truth. Sovereignty demanded courage, careful planning, and collective participation. History will remember not just our defiance, he mused, but how we sustained it, how we built from it, and how we inspired generations to come. As Africa embraced this new dawn of renewal, one question hovered over every capital, market, and community. Could this model of resilience, civic engagement, and continental unity endure the challenges of the next decade? And what new horizons might it unlock for a continent determined to write its own destiny?